Hey folks, Lara here. Before we get into the audiobook, I just want to welcome all the new subscribers. We now have 209 subscribers and growing daily. Thanks for your love and support. Let's get back to the new audiobook. Winter's Companion, written by Lara Replica, artwork by Takia Mann. Chapter 1, Arrival at Silver Pines. The bus rumbled along the icy road, its tires crunching over fresh snow. Ethan Carter leaned his forehead against the window, watching the towering pines blur past as the vehicle climbed higher into the mountains. Silver Pines Ski Resort. He had been here once before, years ago, but it looked different now. Colder, emptier, despite the holiday season. "Cheer up, Ethan. This trip is supposed to be fun," his mother said, nudging him playfully. Ethan forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Fun. Right. A week of family bonding, ski lessons, and watching his dad struggle to light a fire in their rental cabin. He wasn't ungrateful. He just wasn't in the mood for forced enthusiasm. His father, seated in front of them, glanced back. "We'll be at the lodge soon. You bringing your snowboard?" "Yeah," Ethan muttered, though he had no real intention of using it. The bus pulled into the resort parking lot, where the Silver Pines Lodge stood in all its rustic glory. Icicles hung from its eaves, and warm golden light spilled from the tall windows. Families bustled about, wrapped in thick coats and scarves, dragging luggage toward the entrance. A massive wooden sign, dusted with fresh snow, welcomed them. Silver Pines Ski Resort East. 1957. A man in a thick flannel jacket and snow boots stood near the lodge's entrance, barking orders at staff. Mr. Grayson, the resort's owner. Ethan remembered him as a no-nonsense type, always gruff, never smiling. "All right, let's get inside before we freeze," his father said, pulling his duffel bag over his shoulder. Ethan followed his parents into the warmth of the lodge, the scent of pine wood and cinnamon filling his nostrils. He exhaled, watching his breath disappear, and wondered if this trip would be as uneventful as he expected, or if something was waiting for him out there, buried beneath the snow. The wolf cub's plight. Ethan trudged through the thick snow, his boots sinking with each step. The crisp mountain air bit at his exposed skin, but he didn't mind. Anything was better than being stuck inside, forced into awkward conversations with ski instructors, or enduring his dad's enthusiastic yet painfully uncoordinated attempts at snowboarding. His parents were busy unpacking at the cabin, leaving him with a rare moment of solitude. The resort itself was lively, but Ethan had veered off the main trail, drawn by the quiet of the snow-covered forest beyond the resort's boundaries. A sharp yelp pierced the silence. Ethan froze. His breath curled in the cold air as he turned toward the sound. It came from the trees just ahead. He hesitated, debating whether he should investigate. The cry had been brief but pained. Another whimper followed, weaker this time. His pulse quickened as he followed the noise, weaving through frost-covered branches. And then he saw it. A wolf cub, no older than a few months, lay tangled in a patch of deep snow. But it wasn't just struggling against the cold. Its front leg was caught in a steel bear trap. Ethan's stomach twisted. The cub's fur was matted with blood, its small body trembling with exhaustion. It must have been trapped for hours, if not longer. Its pale gray eyes locked onto him, wide with terror. He took a cautious step forward, raising his hands in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "Hey, it's okay," he murmured, though his voice was barely more than a breath. The cub let out a feeble snarl, but it had no strength left to fight. Ethan dropped to his knees beside it, snow dampening his jeans. He reached for the trap, his gloved fingers wrapping around the icy metal. It was rusted but still lethal. He tried prying it open, but it barely budged. Come on," he muttered, teeth clenched. The cub whimpered, its breathing ragged. Time was running out. Ethan forced all his weight against the mechanism. His muscles strained, his palms ached, but finally, the trap snapped open with a metallic clang. The cub recoiled, too weak to run, but free at last. Ethan reached out, hesitating before brushing a hand over its trembling body. It didn't flinch this time. Its heartbeat was erratic, and its injured leg was bent at an unnatural angle. If he left it here, it wouldn't survive the night. He exhaled, glancing back toward the resort. "You're coming with me," he whispered. Scooping the cub into his arms, he turned and headed back toward the cabin, unaware of the consequences that would soon follow. Warnings and resistance. Ethan kicked the snow off his boots before slipping into the warmth of the cabin. The weight in his arms stirred slightly, letting out a weak whimper. He pulled his jacket tighter around the cub, shielding it from the cold as he shut the door quietly behind him. The fireplace crackled, filling the cabin with golden light. His parents were still upstairs, probably unpacking. Good. He needed time to figure out what to do next. Carefully, he set the cub down on the thick rug in front of the fire. The little creature barely moved, its shallow breaths the only sign of life. Up close, Ethan could see how fragile it was, its ribs faintly visible beneath damp fur, its injured leg bent awkwardly. Blood still matted its paw where the steel trap had bitten into it. His heart clenched. This wasn't just some wild animal. This was a life, one that had trusted him enough not to run the moment it was freed. Kneeling beside it, Ethan shrugged off his jacket, then grabbed a clean towel from the couch. He gently dabbed the cub's fur, careful around its leg. "You're a tough little guy," he murmured. The cub barely reacted, only blinking up at him with groggy, unfocused eyes. He needed supplies, antiseptic, bandages, something to keep it warm. His mom always packed a first aid kit for trips like these, and he knew exactly where it was. Ethan stood and moved toward the bathroom when... "Ethan?" He froze. His mother stood at the bottom of the stairs, her gaze dropping instantly to the bundle of fur beside the fire. Her expression hardened. "What," she said slowly, "is that?" His father appeared behind her, frowning. Ethan swallowed. "I found him in the woods. He was caught in a bear trap." His mother's face twisted with concern. "Oh, Ethan." She stepped closer, peering down at the cub. "It's hurt." "I know," he said quickly. "I was going to clean the wound." "You need to take it back," his father interrupted. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "Now." Ethan's chest tightened. "Dad, it won't survive out there." "Not like this." His father sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "It's a wild animal, Ethan. Its mother is probably looking for it." His mother hesitated. "If the mother was anywhere nearby, she would have helped it already," she said softly. "But Ethan, keeping a wild wolf isn't safe." Ethan knew that. He wasn't stupid. He'd heard the warnings about wolves since childhood, but this wasn't some ruthless predator. It was a cub, helpless and in pain. "I just want to help," he said. His voice quieter now. His mother looked torn. His father, less so. Before either of them could argue further, a sharp knock rattled the door. Ethan's stomach dropped. His father opened it to reveal a tall figure, bundled in a thick coat, snow clinging to the fabric. "Mr. Grayson." "Evening, Carter," the resort owner greeted, his deep voice carrying the weight of authority. His sharp eyes flicked from Ethan to the small form on the rug. His expression darkened instantly. "You need to get rid of that." "Now," Ethan bristled. "Why?" Grayson stepped inside, shaking snow from his hat. "Because wolves don't belong near people. You think it's cute now, but when it grows up, it'll be dangerous. It'll see humans as a food source, not friends." His gaze hardened. "And we don't feed wolves here." Ethan clenched his fists. "I'm not feeding it. I'm helping it." "Same thing," Grayson said coolly. "If you feed a wild animal, it loses its fear of humans. That never ends well. For anyone." Ethan's mother gave him a worried look. "Ethan, I know you mean well, but..." "But..." There was always a but. Grayson exhaled, shifting his weight. "Look, kid, if it can still walk, let it go. If it's too injured, I can put it down quickly. No suffering." Ethan's stomach flipped. "No," he said immediately, stepping protectively in front of the cub. The idea of it being put down after everything it had been through made his chest tighten painfully. Grayson's face remained unreadable. "You getting attached?" Ethan didn't answer. A long silence stretched between them before his father finally sighed. "Let him take care of it for the night," he said reluctantly. "We'll figure something out in the morning." Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line, but he gave a short nod. "You make sure it's gone by sunrise," he warned, then turned and stepped back into the cold, the door shut behind him, leaving an uneasy silence. Ethan glanced down at the cub, its small body curled near the fire, completely unaware of the fight just waged over its life. He didn't care what Grayson said. He wasn't letting this little creature die. Not now. Not ever. A secret haven. Ethan waited until his parents had gone to bed. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind whistle through the trees outside the cabin. The wolf cub rested beside the fireplace, its tiny body rising and falling with each shallow breath. It hadn't moved much since Ethan cleaned its wound and wrapped its injured leg with strips of bandages he'd taken from the first aid kit. He had only bought himself time, because come morning his father would make him release it, and if Grayson found the cub still lingering around the resort, he'd end it without hesitation. Ethan turned onto his side, anxiety gnawing at his chest. He couldn't let that happen. The clock on the wall read 2:14 a.m. His parents' bedroom door was closed. The cabin was silent except for the crackling of the dying fire. Now or never. Moving as quietly as he could, Ethan slipped out of bed and pulled on his jacket. He grabbed an old fleece blanket from the couch and crouched next to the cub. It stirred slightly, but didn't resist when he carefully scooped it into his arms, wrapping it in the warm fabric. The moment he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a slap. The air was sharp and dry, and the snow crunched beneath his boots as he crept away from the cabin. His breath curled in front of him, each exhale visible in the frigid air. His mind raced. Where can I take it? He couldn't leave it in the open. Even if its leg healed, it was too young to fend for itself, and if it wandered back near the resort, it wouldn't stand a chance. Then he remembered. The cave. A couple of years ago, on their last trip here, Ethan had stumbled upon a small cave nestled within the trees, about a mile from the resort's main trails. He hadn't thought much of it back then, but now it could be the cub's best shot at survival. A desperate trek. The hike was brutal. The snow had hardened overnight, making the trek slippery and uneven. Ethan's legs burned as he trudged through the knee-high drifts, the cub shifting weakly in his arms every so often. Halfway there, he almost turned back. The wind howled between the trees, and a deep part of him, one that still held on to the childhood fear of wolves lurking in the shadows, wondered if something was watching him. But he forced himself to keep going. By the time he reached the cave, he was shaking from both exhaustion and the cold. It was exactly as he remembered, a shallow, rocky shelter tucked between the roots of a fallen tree. The ground inside was dry, mostly shielded from the snow. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Ethan knelt and set the cub down gently. The little thing barely reacted, just blinking sleepily up at him. "This is good, right?" Ethan whispered, unwrapping the fleece blanket and tucking it into the corner to create a small bed. "You'll be safe here." The cub didn't respond, obviously too weak to understand, but as Ethan placed it on the blanket, it curled up into a tight little ball, sighing softly. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand through his snow-dampened hair. Now what? Leaving it here felt wrong, even though he knew he couldn't keep it. But maybe he could help it recover first. His stomach twisted. He knew what that meant. Sneaking out, stealing food, lying. If he got caught, his parents would lose their minds. But then he looked at the cub's bandaged leg and knew he had already made his decision. "I'll come back," he promised quietly. And then, before doubt could creep in, he turned and began the long, cold walk back to the cabin. Bonding in the shadows. Ethan lay in bed, wide awake. The cold from his late-night trek still clung to his skin, but it wasn't what kept him up. His thoughts raced. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cub curled up in the dark, alone in that cave. Was it warm enough? Was it scared? Did it even have a chance? By the time the first traces of dawn filtered through the window, he had made up his mind. He had to go back. A hidden routine. For the next 2 weeks, Ethan lived a double life. During the day, he played along, joining his parents for meals, pretending to listen to ski instructors, nodding whenever his dad talked about embracing the great outdoors. But as soon as night fell, his real focus took over. Every evening after his parents went to bed, he snuck out. The trek to the cave was always brutal. The snow deepened with each passing day, and the cold felt sharper. But each time he arrived, the cub was there, waiting, and each time it seemed a little stronger. It ate the scraps he smuggled from the cabin, bits of cooked meat from dinner, pieces of bread when meat wasn't an option. The first few nights, it barely had the strength to lift its head, but as the days passed, its appetite grew. By the 5th night, it could hobble toward him on its wounded leg. By the 8th, it wagged its tail slightly when he arrived. And by the 12th night, something remarkable happened. Ethan sat cross-legged near the cave's entrance, holding out the last bit of bread from his pocket. The cub had finished eating, But instead of retreating like usual, it hesitated. Then, slowly, it crept toward him and nudged its head against his knee. Ethan froze, startled by the simple gesture. Then a small, disbelieving laugh escaped him. "You trust me now, huh?" The cub didn't answer, obviously, but it stayed close, curling up beside him with a soft sigh. Something inside Ethan warmed. He had never felt a bond like this before, not with a pet, not even with a person. It wasn't just an animal anymore. It was a companion, a close call. By the end of the second week, the cub had nearly fully healed. The wound on its leg was no longer raw, and though it still limped, the strength had returned to its small frame. Ethan knew, deep down, that this meant his time with it was running out. He couldn't keep it forever. But as much as he tried to prepare himself, the thought of leaving it completely gutted him. One evening, while he was feeding it bits of dried meat, he heard a sound in the distance. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat. Grayson? His father? He grabbed the cub and pressed himself against the cave wall, holding his breath as the sound of boots crunching in the snow grew closer. "Dang coyotes again," a man muttered. Ethan recognized the voice, one of the resort staff. "Thought I saw a wolf near the trails yesterday," another voice grumbled. "Grayson wants us to keep an eye out." Ethan's pulse pounded. If they checked the cave, if they saw the cub. But after a few more grumbling complaints, the footsteps faded into the trees. Ethan exhaled shakily, feeling the cub press closer to him. They weren't safe here forever, and deep down, Ethan knew what had to come next. Tomorrow night would be goodbye, a heartfelt goodbye. Ethan's boots crunched softly in the snow as he made his way to the cave for the last time. He had known this day was coming, had told himself it would be easier once the cub was healed. But now as he approached the familiar hollow in the trees, his chest felt tight. This wasn't just about saving the cub anymore. It was about letting go. The cub was waiting for him as always, ears perking up at the sound of his footsteps. It limped toward him, but it wasn't the weak, fragile thing he had found weeks ago. Its fur had thickened against the cold, its wounds had closed, and despite the slight favoring of one leg, it could move with strength. It was ready. Ethan crouched down, running a hand through the thick fur behind its ears. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. "Guess what? You're all set now." The cub blinked at him, tilting its head slightly. Ethan forced a smile, though his throat burned. "I can't keep coming back," he said, voice quieter now. "You've got to figure things out on your own." The cub huffed softly but didn't move. Ethan swallowed hard. He had brought one last meal, a small piece of cooked chicken he had managed to take from dinner. He set it down near the cave's entrance and stood. The cub didn't eat. Instead, it took a step closer, pressing its small body against his leg. Ethan froze, his chest aching. "I know," he whispered, dropping back down and wrapping his arms around the tiny creature. The fur was warm, soft, familiar. A lump formed in his throat. He had spent 2 weeks sneaking through the snow, keeping this secret, breaking the rules, doing everything to keep this cub safe. And now he was supposed to just walk away? His fingers curled into the fur one last time. "You're going to be okay," he promised. "You're strong. You'll find a pack. Maybe you already have one waiting for you." The cub didn't move for a long time. Then, finally, it stepped back, staring up at him with those pale gray eyes. And just like that, Ethan turned and walked away. He didn't look back. He couldn't. A message left behind. That night, Ethan lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The ache in his chest refused to fade. Had he done the right thing? Would the cub survive? He didn't know, and that uncertainty ate at him. But then, just as sleep was about to claim him, a soft, melodic howl echoed through the trees outside. Ethan's eyes shot open. He sat up, heart pounding, listening. The sound came again, clearer this time. He scrambled out of bed, throwing open the curtains. The night was dark, the snow-covered ground bathed in silver moonlight. There was no movement, no sign of the cub. But he knew. He knew. And in the morning, when he went back to the cave one last time, there was only one thing left behind. Half of a freshly caught fish, placed carefully on the bed of fleece he had made. Ethan let out a slow, shaky breath, a small smile tugging at his lips. The cub had left him a message. It was going to be okay. And somehow so was he. Leaving Silver Pines? Ethan stood outside the cabin, staring out at the snow-covered forest, hands stuffed deep into his coat pockets. His breath curled in the freezing air as he exhaled, but he barely noticed the cold. His chest felt hollow, as if something had been taken from him. The cub was gone. It had left the fish, its silent way of saying goodbye, of thanking him. But still, part of him felt like he was leaving behind a piece of himself. "Ethan, let's go," his father's voice called from the cabin door. Ethan turned, stealing one last glance toward the trees before trudging toward the waiting car. The ride home was long and quiet. His mother chatted about the trip, his father occasionally chiming in with talk of work, but Ethan barely heard them. He sat in the back seat, staring out the window as the resort disappeared behind them, swallowed by the vast white landscape. Would the cub make it? Would it find others? He clenched his fists. He would never know. By the time they reached home, the resort and the wolf felt like a distant dream. Life moves on. Ethan tried to fall back into normal life, but something had changed. School felt dull. The halls, the lockers, the everyday conversations, none of it seemed to matter anymore. He was supposed to be thinking about his future, college, careers, a path forward, but all he could think about was the woods. After school, he often disappeared into the nearby forests, hiking alone for hours. His parents thought he was training for sports or clearing his head. They didn't know the real reason. He was searching. Not for the cub. He knew that was impossible. But for the feeling he had in the mountains, that connection to something wild, something real. But no matter how far he walked, he never found it again. By the time graduation rolled around, he had learned to bury the memories. Meeting Samantha. Ethan met Samantha Parker at a summer camping trip with mutual friends. She was different from anyone he had ever known, fearless, outspoken, and always pushing boundaries. They clicked almost instantly. "You're too serious," she teased once, poking at his arm while they sat around the campfire. "What's going on in that overthinking brain of yours?" Ethan smirked. "Nothing you'd find interesting. Try me." So, for the first time in years, he talked about Silver Pines. The mountains, the resort, the nights spent wandering the snow. But he never told her about the cub. It was his secret, his alone. Yet, despite everything, Samantha understood him in a way no one else did. And before long, they were inseparable. A new chapter. Ethan never wanted an office job. After high school, while his friends went off to college, he started working at an outdoor adventure company, guiding hikes, leading survival courses, teaching people how to navigate the wilderness. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what his parents had imagined for him, but it was where he belonged. Samantha supported him. She was studying environmental science and often joined him on hikes, challenging him with facts about ecosystems, climate change, and conservation. "You're like some kind of mountain ghost," she joked once, nudging him, always looking toward the wild. Ethan only shrugged. Maybe she was right. Then, on the night of his 21st birthday, she had an idea. "Let's go skiing." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "For your birthday. Let's go back to Silver Pines." His stomach twisted. "Why?" Samantha smiled. "Because it's been 4 years, and I've never seen you talk about any other place the way you talk about that one." He hesitated. "Come on," she pressed. "It's your place. Let's make some new memories there." Their friends, Jake and Lauren, would rent a separate cottage, giving them privacy. It would be the perfect getaway. Ethan looked down at his drink, then back at Samantha. A return to Silver Pines. He had spent years pretending that part of him was gone. Now, for the first time, he wondered, had it ever really left? The return begins. Packing for the trip felt strange. Ethan had spent years avoiding thoughts of Silver Pines, pushing the memories away. But now, as he stuffed his bag with gloves, jackets, and thermal gear, the past crept back in. The snow, the cub, the cave, the way it had looked at him that final night. He shook himself. It had been 4 years. The cub was either long gone or just another wolf in a vast, endless wilderness. Nothing was waiting for him out there, right? As he zipped his bag, Samantha grinned from the doorway. Excited? Ethan forced a smirk, something like that. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something was waiting for him in those mountains, and soon he would find out what. Back to the mountains! The road to Silver Pines ski resort looked exactly as Ethan remembered, winding through the dense evergreens, the trees heavy with fresh snow. The same towering peaks loomed in the distance, their sharp ridges cutting into the winter sky. And yet, everything felt different. He sat in the passenger seat, watching the landscape blur past as Samantha drove. She tapped her fingers against the steering wheel, humming along to the music playing softly through the speakers. "Feels weird, huh?" she asked, glancing at him. Ethan smirked. "Yeah, it does." It wasn't just nostalgia. It was something deeper, a feeling settling in his chest, a tension that hadn't been there before. The resort was waiting for him. He didn't know why, but he could feel it. In the back seat, their friends Jake and Lauren were caught up in their own conversation, debating which ski trails to hit first. They had been the ones to insist on tagging along, renting their own cottage nearby. "Just imagine it now," Jake said, leaning forward between the seats. "Fresh powder, no responsibilities, and an entire weekend of absolutely wrecking you on the slopes." Ethan rolled his eyes. "We both know I'm better than you. Only in your dreams, mountain boy." Lauren laughed. "All right, children, let's focus on getting there first." Samantha grinned. "We should be at the resort in about 15 minutes. Ethan exhaled slowly. 15 minutes until he faced the past. Chapter 13, Silver Pines, 4 years later. The entrance to Silver Pines Ski Resort looked almost untouched by time. The same rustic lodge greeted them, its large wooden beams dusted with fresh snow. Families bustled about, dragging suitcases and ski gear. Steam curled from chimneys, carrying the familiar scent of burning wood. Even the old wooden sign at the entrance, Silver Pines Ski Resort, East T 1957, stood exactly as he remembered. Ethan climbed out of the car and stretched, feeling the cold mountain air bite at his skin. But beneath the nostalgia, there was something else. A presence. The kind of awareness that prickled at the back of his neck like he was being watched. He scanned the tree line, eyes flickering over the shadowed forest beyond the resort. Nothing. "Earth to Ethan," Samantha teased, nudging him. "You okay?" "Yeah," he said quickly, shaking off the feeling, just taking it in. He helped unload their bags while Jake and Lauren checked into their cottage. His and Samantha's cabin was tucked further back, near the edge of the woods, a secluded, cozy space for just the two of them. "Nice, right?" Samantha said as they stepped inside. The cabin was warm and inviting, with a fireplace crackling in the corner and large windows overlooking the snowy landscape. Ethan set his bag down and gave a small smile. "Yeah, it's perfect." But as he glanced toward the forest, a whisper of doubt crept in, because somewhere out there, past the slopes and the cabins, something was waiting for him. And this time, it wouldn't be a cub, it would be something else entirely. The argument and solitary hike. The first day at Silver Pines passed in a blur of laughter, skiing, and warm drinks by the fire. Jake and Lauren had dragged Ethan and Samantha onto the slopes almost immediately, challenging each other to races down the easier trails before daring to take on the more advanced routes. Ethan had expected to feel uneasy being back here. Instead, the familiar rush of wind against his face, the spray of snow beneath his board, and the crisp mountain air had settled him, for a while. But the feeling of being watched never truly left him. Even as he laughed with Samantha, even as they sat by the fire that evening, drinking hot cocoa and listening to the low murmur of voices in the lodge, he felt it. A presence lingering at the edge of his awareness. Something out there. Something waiting. And then the argument happened. The tension breaks. It started as a small thing, a misunderstanding, a misstep in conversation. Samantha had been telling a story, one that involved an old friend from college. Ethan had only half been listening, lost in his own thoughts, and when she nudged him for a response, he had given a distracted, "Huh?" The shift was almost immediate. Her expression cooled, her posture stiffened. "You're not even listening, are you?" Ethan sighed, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Sorry, my head's somewhere else. That's the problem, Ethan. It's always somewhere else." He blinked, taken aback by the sharpness in her tone. Samantha wasn't someone who picked fights over small things. If she was upset, it meant something deeper was bubbling beneath the surface. "You've been weird ever since we got here," she continued, voice quieter now, but still edged with frustration. "Distant, distracted. You keep looking over your shoulder like you're waiting for something to happen." Ethan exhaled, his chest tightening. She wasn't wrong. "I don't know, Sam," he admitted. "Being back here just brings stuff up." "Like what?" He hesitated. He could tell her about the cub, about the sleepless nights he spent wondering if it survived. about the fact that even now he felt like he was being drawn back to something in the forest. But the words wouldn't come. Samantha studied him for a long moment, then shook her head. "See? This is what I mean. You never let me in." Ethan opened his mouth, but she was already standing, grabbing her coat. "I need some air," she muttered before disappearing out the door. A lone walk into the woods. Ethan sat there for a while, staring into the fire, the heat doing nothing to ease the cold in his chest. She was right. He had never let anyone in, not fully. Maybe it was because he didn't know how. With a heavy sigh, he stood, grabbing his own coat. If Samantha needed space, he'd give it to her. And maybe he needed some space too. A walk would clear his head. He wouldn't go far, just past the cabins, near the edge of the tree line. Just enough to breathe. The air outside was colder than before, the temperature dropping fast now that the sun had disappeared behind the mountains. He walked without thinking, his feet moving through the snow-covered paths, leading him away from the warm glow of the cabins and toward the darker, quieter parts of the resort. Toward the forest. The further he went, the stronger the feeling grew. A pull. A presence. Then he saw it. At the edge of the trees, just barely visible against the snowy landscape, a figure, dark, still. Watching, his breath hitched, the wind howled through the trees, but the figure did not move. Ethan took a step closer, and in that instant, it turned and vanished into the woods. A chill ran down his spine. His heart pounded. He should go back. He should turn around, return to Samantha, fix what was broken between them. But instead, he took a step into the trees, and then another. Following. The storm unleashed. The moment Ethan stepped into the trees, the world changed. The resort, the cabins, the warm glow of firelight, they all vanished behind him. Here, among the towering pines, the air was thicker, the silence deeper. Snow fell in slow, drifting patterns, absorbing all sound except for his own footsteps crunching over ice and frost. And yet that feeling, that pull, remained. Something was here. Something was waiting. Ethan's breath curled in the freezing air as he walked further, his eyes scanning the shifting shadows between the trees. The figure he had seen was gone, but his gut told him he wasn't alone. The trees whispered around him as the wind picked up, an eerie symphony of creaks and rustling branches. Then in the distance, a low, guttural growl. Ethan stopped cold. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he turned toward the sound. Something moved in the darkness ahead. A shape, large, slow, and unmistakably canine. Ethan's pulse spiked. The logical part of his brain told him to turn back, to get out of the woods before he found himself face to face with a predator. But before he could move, the wind shifted. And then, a distant howl echoed through the forest. Low, haunting, familiar. Ethan's chest tightened. No, it couldn't be. The moment of hesitation cost him. The wind suddenly roared, tearing through the trees in a violent gust. Ethan stumbled back as snow exploded around him, blinding him. The sky above had turned from a deep twilight blue to a stormy, churning gray. The temperature plummeted. In the span of seconds, the still, quiet forest was replaced by a full-fledged blizzard. Panic gripped him as he turned, trying to retrace his steps. But the world had become an endless swirl of white. The path was gone. The trees had blurred into shifting shadows. And worst of all, the ground beneath him gave way. The fall, Ethan felt the moment his footing failed. 1 second he was stumbling through the snow, the next the earth disappeared beneath him. His stomach lurched as he plummeted through the air, the wind screaming past his ears. Then, impact. Pain erupted through his body as he crashed into the rocks below. The world spun, stars burst behind his eyes, and then darkness. 3 hours later, a deep, bone-numbing cold dragged Ethan back to consciousness. His eyelids felt heavy, but when he forced them open, the storm had calmed. The sky above was still dark, but the wind had quieted, leaving only a soft drifting snowfall in its wake. Pain throbbed through his body. His leg, something was wrong with his leg. Gritting his teeth, he tried to move. Agony shot through him. Broken. His leg was broken. A harsh, shuddering breath left his lips as reality sank in. He had fallen at least 30 feet. He was in the middle of the wilderness, alone, injured, and freezing. And worst of all, no one knew where he was. Shadows in the snow. Pain was the first thing Ethan felt. A deep, throbbing ache radiated from his leg, sending sharp jolts of agony through his body with every shallow breath. His limbs were stiff, his fingers numb. His clothes, once warm and dry, were now soaked with melted snow, clinging to his skin like ice. The cold was creeping in, and if he didn't move soon, it would consume him. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself to sit up. His vision swam, dark spots dancing at the edges of his sight, but he pushed through it. He needed to think. The fall had landed him in a rocky outcrop, surrounded by jagged stones and snow-covered slopes. No trails, no markers, no sign of civilization. He was utterly, completely alone. Except something was watching him. The sensation prickled along his spine, an undeniable instinctual feeling. Slowly, he turned his head. At first, he saw only trees. Dark, looming pines stretching skyward, their snow-laden branches creaking softly in the wind. Then, movement. A shadow shifted between the trunks, then another, and another. 3 figures. Large, low to the ground, circling. His pulse spiked. Wolves. Their shapes were barely visible through the swirling snow, but there was no mistaking them. The way they moved. Slow, patient, waiting. They had been following him. His breath hitched as he fought the rising wave of panic. Predators sensed weakness. If he moved too fast, if he showed fear, they'd close in. He reached for a branch nearby, something, anything to defend himself, when a low growl cut through the silence, a warning. One of the wolves stepped forward, emerging into the dim light. It was massive, larger than any wolf Ethan had ever seen up close. Its fur was a mix of deep gray and black, dusted with snow. Its eyes, a piercing yellow, locked onto him with a terrifying intensity. It wanted him to run, to fight, to struggle. Because that's what prey did. But Ethan wasn't prey. And just as he braced himself for the inevitable, a new presence emerged from the storm. The guardian returns, a blur of motion. A second wolf leapt from the darkness, but this one wasn't attacking him. It crashed into the lead predator with a ferocious snarl, teeth bared, claws scraping against ice. Ethan's breath caught. The first wolf yelped in surprise, staggering back as its attacker planted itself between Ethan and the others. A powerful black-furred wolf with a scarred front leg. Ethan's vision blurred, his thoughts fractured. No, it couldn't be. The lead predator growled, stepping forward again, but the black wolf snapped its jaws, a deep, rumbling warning vibrating through its chest. And for the first time, Ethan saw it. Recognition. Not just from him, but from the wolf. The same pale gray eyes from all those years ago, now sharper, older, more feral. The cub. His cub. Now a full-grown alpha. Ethan exhaled, barely able to process the sheer impossibility of it. The other wolves hesitated. For a long, tense moment, they stood frozen, waiting. Then, without another sound, they turned and disappeared into the storm. Ethan's head spun, his body trembled, his injuries screaming in protest. But none of it mattered, because his wolf had come back for him, and this time, it was his turn to be saved. A test of loyalty. Ethan's body felt like it was shutting down. The cold had sunk into his bones, his leg throbbed with unbearable pain, and his vision blurred at the edges. But none of that mattered, because the wolf was still there. Not the shadowed predator that had stalked him through the snow, not the silent hunter that had threatened his life. His wolf, the same cub he had nursed back to health all those years ago, now a full-grown alpha, standing between him and certain death. The realization sent a shock of warmth through him, momentarily cutting through the cold. The black wolf turned toward him now, stepping closer, its paws crunching softly in the snow. Its breath curled in the frozen air, eyes locked onto Ethan's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Ethan swallowed, forcing himself to sit up despite the fiery pain in his leg. "It's really you," he rasped, barely believing the words even as he said them. The wolf didn't move, didn't blink. Then, slowly, deliberately, it took another step forward and lowered its head. A memory surged through Ethan's mind, the cub nudging its tiny head against his knee all those years ago, trusting him for the first time. And now, here they were again. Only this time, Ethan was the one in need of saving. His throat tightened, his vision blurred. But before he could speak, the wolf suddenly turned away and bounded a few feet ahead, with glancing back expectantly. It wanted him to follow. Ethan gritted his teeth. He knew he couldn't walk, his leg was broken. But he could crawl. He had to. With a shaky breath, he dragged himself forward, using his arms to pull through the thick snow. Every movement sent lightning bolts of pain through his body, but he refused to stop. The wolf led him forward, never straying too far. watching, waiting. The storm had settled into a soft snowfall now, but the temperature was still dropping. Ethan's hands were numb, his body exhausted, his mind slipping toward the dangerous edge of unconsciousness. But the wolf didn't let him stop. It growled whenever he hesitated, stepping closer as if to remind him, "Keep moving. Stay awake. Don't give up." Ethan clenched his jaw and pushed forward, even as the darkness threatened to pull him under. Then, just as his strength was about to give out, the wolf turned sharply and disappeared behind a ridge. Ethan dragged himself over the last stretch of snow, gasping for air. And then he saw it. A cave. Sanctuary in the snow. His cave. The same one he had once used to shelter a wounded cub. And now that same cub had brought him back. His vision swam. His limbs shook with exhaustion. But somehow he forced himself inside, collapsing onto the dry stone floor. The warmth hit him immediately. The cave was shielded from the wind, and the black wolf had already padded further in, shaking snow from its thick fur. Ethan barely had time to register the irony. Years ago, he had kept the wolf safe in this very place. Now the wolf was keeping him alive. His breath shuddered as he lay back against the cool stone, the fire in his leg making him dizzy. The wolf stepped closer, eyes gleaming in the dim light. Ethan exhaled a weak laugh. "Guess I owe you one." The wolf didn't respond, of course. But it didn't leave his side. Not that night, not at all. It had chosen to stay, and for the first time since the fall, Ethan finally let himself believe he would survive. Humor amidst hardship. Ethan woke to the rhythmic sound of breathing. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was. His body was stiff, his leg ached, and the air was freezing. But compared to the sheer agony of the night before, this pain was dull, manageable. Then he noticed the black-furred shape curled near the cave's entrance. The wolf. Not a dream, not a hallucination. The same cub he had saved 4 years ago, now a powerful alpha that had dragged him back to safety. Ethan exhaled, his breath visible in the cold. His leg was still broken, he was still stranded, but he wasn't alone, and somehow that made all the difference. A desperate drink. His throat was dry, painfully so. He needed water, but there was none in sight. His mind drifted, struggling to focus. Then he remembered. Snow. He reached out weakly and scooped a handful from the cave's entrance, shoving it into his mouth. For half a second, it was refreshing. The ice melted instantly, cooling his parched throat. Then the brain freeze hit. It was instantaneous and brutal. Ethan let out a sharp, strangled groan, clutching his head as if that would somehow stop the icy dagger of pain stabbing through his skull. The wolf lifted its head sharply at the sound, ears perked, eyes gleaming with silent amusement. Ethan slumped back against the rock, muttering through gritted teeth, "Man, I gotta go slow on the snow." The wolf huffed. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a snort, but it had the distinct tone of mild amusement. Ethan blinked at it. "Did you just laugh at me?" The wolf didn't respond, but its tail flicked once. Ethan shook his head, still pressing a hand to his temple. "Unbelievable. 4 years later and you're still judging me." The wolf settled back down, its gaze never leaving him. Ethan exhaled slowly, despite the lingering brain freeze of death. The situation was dire. He was stranded, injured, and entirely dependent on a wild animal for survival. But somehow, despite everything, a small crooked smile found its way onto his face. Because if the wolf could still laugh at him, maybe things weren't so hopeless after all. Samantha's realization. Samantha woke with a sense of unease. For a moment, she thought it was just the remnants of last night's argument weighing on her. But as she rolled over in bed and stretched, she noticed something wrong. The other side of the bed was empty. Cold, her stomach tightened. Ethan wasn't there. She sat up, pushing the blanket aside. The cabin was quiet, save for the faint hum of the heater. His coat was gone from the hook by the door. Her pulse picked up. A slow realization? Samantha pulled on her jacket, stepping outside into the crisp morning air. The resort was waking up. Skiers were heading toward the lifts, families were gathering for breakfast. But there was no sign of Ethan. Maybe he had gone for a walk to cool off. Maybe he was at the pub, grabbing an early drink. But something felt off. She turned and headed toward the main lodge. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee and wood smoke greeted her, along with the familiar hum of conversation. Jake and Lauren were already at a table near the window, mugs in hand. "Hey," Samantha said, forcing her voice to stay casual. "Have you guys seen Ethan?" Jake shook his head. "Nope, thought he was with you." Lauren frowned. "Wait, you mean he never came back last night?" The unease in Samantha's chest deepened. She glanced out the window at the vast, snow-covered trails. Something was wrong. She could feel it. The search begins. By midday, her worry had turned into panic. Ethan was nowhere. She had checked the pub, the rental shop, even the ski lifts, nothing. By early afternoon, she had gone to resort management. "I'm sure he just went off on a hike," the receptionist had said kindly. "People lose track of time out there. He'll be back soon." But he didn't come back. And by nightfall, a search party was formed. Samantha stood outside the lodge, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring at the forest. The storm had been brutal last night, and Ethan had been out there alone. Her stomach twisted painfully. She should have stopped him. She should have gone after him. And now, she might never see him again. Fading hope. The first day of searching yielded nothing. No footprints. No sign of Ethan's trail. The snowfall had buried everything. By the time night fell, Samantha's hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the sheer weight of dread pressing against her chest. Ethan was out there, alone, and every hour that passed made survival less likely. Desperate measures. By the second day, the resort's management had escalated the search. Ski patrol, staff, and volunteers combed the mountains, calling his name, scanning the slopes, checking the ravines. But as the hours dragged on, Samantha noticed it. The shift, the change in people's expressions, the quiet resignation. Hope was slipping. No one said it out loud, but she saw it in their eyes. They thought Ethan was dead. A gut-wrenching discovery. By the end of the third day, Samantha was out of options. So she did something desperate. She went to the airport. A last-ditch effort. Maybe, somehow, Ethan had gotten angry after their fight and left without telling her. Maybe he had taken an earlier flight home. Maybe. But when she reached the ticket counter and asked if anyone named Ethan Carter had checked into a flight, the attendant gave her a small, polite frown. "I'm sorry," she said. "We have no record of an Ethan Carter leaving Silver Pines." Samantha's heart shattered. He was still here, somewhere, lost, or worse. The wolf's final act. The fifth day dawned cold and merciless. By now, the search efforts had begun to dwindle. The resort staff, though sympathetic, had quietly begun shifting focus, less on finding Ethan alive and more on recovering a body. Samantha saw it in their faces, the way the volunteers spoke in hushed voices, the way people avoided meeting her eyes. It was unbearable. Jake and Lauren tried to comfort her, but what was there to say? The weight of helplessness pressed down on them all. And by that afternoon, the search party was called off. The storm had been too brutal, they reasoned. No one could have survived out there for 5 nights. No one. But they didn't know Ethan. They didn't know what he had already survived before. And they certainly didn't know that. Deep in the woods, in a secluded cave, Ethan wasn't alone. A disrupted morning walk. That same afternoon, Mr. Grayson, the resort's longtime owner, was out for his daily walk with his old hunting dog, Rufus. The trail was empty, untouched by skiers. It was a familiar route, one he had walked 100 times before. But today felt different. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no distant calls of wildlife. Even Rufus, usually eager to explore, was tense, his ears perked, his nose twitching as if something wasn't right. Then, out of nowhere, the dog whimpered. And before Grayson could react, Rufus let out a yelp and was yanked off his feet by a wolf. A chase through the woods, Grayson's heart nearly stopped. A massive black wolf had darted from the trees, clamping its powerful jaws around Rufus's scruff, not attacking but dragging him away. "What they?" Grayson roared, fumbling for the rifle slung over his shoulder. But the wolf didn't run toward the trees. It didn't disappear into the forest like a predator taking down prey. It was leading him. Grayson stumbled after it, rifle in hand, heart hammering. The wolf moved with purpose, disappearing over a snow-covered ridge, dragging the yelping dog along with shocking ease. "What the heck is going on?" Grayson muttered, his breath coming out in harsh white puffs. Then he crested the ridge, and his world tilted. The discovery at first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. A cave entrance, partially buried under layers of frost, and just outside of it, a body, sprawled in the snow, motionless. Grayson's breath caught. No. Then the wolf released Rufus and stepped back, watching him expectantly. The meaning hit him like a train. Grayson dropped to his knees, pushing through the snow, hands shaking as he turned the frozen figure over. Ethan Carter. Unconscious, deathly pale, but breathing. A wolf's watchful eyes. Grayson barely registered his own shouted curse. The boy was alive. Barely. He fumbled for his radio, voice urgent. "This is Grayson. I found him. I found the kid. He's alive, but barely. Get a dang medical team up here now." The reply crackled back almost immediately. Urgent, frantic. And yet, as Grayson pressed a hand against Ethan's cold skin, checking for signs of consciousness, the black wolf was still there, watching, not running, not attacking, just watching. And for the first time in his entire life, Grayson, an old hunter, a man who had spent years treating wolves as nothing more than wild threats, felt something else entirely. Respect. No. Gratitude. Because if it hadn't been for that wolf, Ethan Carter would have died. And as the distant sound of approaching rescuers filled the air, Grayson did something he never thought he would. He met the wolf's piercing gray eyes and gave a single, small nod. A silent acknowledgement, a silent thank you. And with that, the wolf turned and disappeared back into the forest, its mission complete. The rescue and reunion. Ethan drifted between consciousness and darkness. He was vaguely aware of voices, shouted orders, the sound of heavy boots crunching through snow. Hands lifted him, wrapped him in warmth. Then, pain. A searing, consuming pain in his leg as something was moved, pressure applied. He groaned, his body weak but still fighting. "He's alive," a voice said. "Let's get him out of here. Now." The next few hours passed in a blur of movement. The wind, the rumble of a snowmobile, the heat of the lodge's medical center. And then, finally, Samantha's voice. A heartfelt reunion. "Ethan!" His eyes fluttered open. The world swam before coming into focus. The hospital bed, the soft beeping of monitors, the weight of warm blankets pressing down on him, and Samantha, standing at his bedside, eyes red-rimmed from crying, her hands gripping his like she might never let go. "Hey," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. She let out a choked laugh, shaking her head as tears spilled down her cheeks. "You absolute idiot." He tried to smirk, but his body was too exhausted. Instead, he just gave her a weak smile. "Yeah, that was a bad one." Samantha exhaled sharply, pressing her forehead against their clasped hands. "You were gone for 5 days," she whispered. 5 days, Ethan. I thought you were—" Her voice broke. Ethan swallowed thickly, his throat aching. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to." "I don't care," she cut in, squeezing his hands tighter. "You're here. That's all that matters." And for the first time since waking up, Ethan let himself relax. The story spreads. News of Ethan Carter's survival spread fast. A young man lost for 5 days in a brutal storm, found barely alive on the brink of death. The miracle rescue, the mysterious wolf encounter. By the time he was discharged from the hospital a week later, the media was waiting. Journalists lined the steps outside, cameras flashing the moment he stepped out into the cold winter air. Samantha walked beside him, one hand gripping his tightly as he limped down the steps. His leg was in a brace, healing but still weak. Microphones were shoved toward him, voices overlapping in rapid-fire questions. "Ethan, how did you survive for so long? Is it true a wolf protected you? Did you really spend 5 nights in a cave?" Ethan took a slow breath, paused. Then, for the first time since the ordeal, he told the truth. "All of it," he said simply. "Everything you've heard is real." The reporters fell silent. He glanced at Samantha before continuing. "I fell off a ridge during the storm, broke my leg, I thought I was dead, until a wolf showed up." His throat tightened slightly, the same wolf I rescued when I was 17. A stunned hush fell over the crowd. "He chased off the predators that were circling me. He dragged me back to shelter. And every night," Ethan's voice softened, "he brought me food. Berries, mostly, just enough to keep me alive." A journalist gaped. "You mean he fed you?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, he took care of me, almost like he was returning the favor for when I saved him as a cub, freeing him from that bear trap and nursing him back to health in the very same cave where he later brought me to safety." The crowd erupted with questions, but Ethan wasn't interested in the spectacle. He glanced past them toward the vast mountain range that loomed in the distance. Somewhere out there among the endless trees and snowfall, the black wolf was still watching, still waiting, still his companion. And for the first time in years, Ethan knew one thing for certain. They would meet again. One day, when the winter called him back. Epilogue. Wolf's Haven. 1 year later. The wind howled through the towering pines, carrying the scent of snow and earth. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bit at exposed skin, but felt invigorating rather than unbearable. Ethan stood at the edge of the Silver Pines resort, hands in the pockets of his heavy coat, staring up at the newest addition to the lodge's entrance, a statue. Not of a skier, not of a lodge founder, but of a wolf. Tall, proud, its head slightly raised as if caught mid-howl. His wolf. The metal plaque at the base read, Wolf's Haven, in honor of the unseen protectors of these mountains. Ethan exhaled slowly. Mr. Grayson, of all people, had been the one to propose the idea. The gruff old man had never been the sentimental type, but after Ethan's rescue, something had changed in him. The resort was officially renamed Wolf's Haven, a tribute to the one that had saved a life. A tribute to the truth that sometimes nature didn't just take, sometimes it gave. A final goodbye. For now. Samantha appeared beside him, nudging his arm. Still thinking about him? Ethan gave her a small smirk. You act like I ever stopped. She rolled her eyes but smiled. It had been a year since that fateful winter. A year since he had been stranded in the snow, fighting to survive. A year since a wolf had come back for him. And yet, no matter how many times he returned to these mountains, no matter how long he stood at the tree line waiting, watching, the wolf never appeared. But Ethan wasn't worried, because he knew deep down his companion was still out there. Maybe one day their paths would cross again. Maybe not. But that wasn't the point. The point was, they had saved each other, and that would always be enough. Ethan turned to Samantha and smiled. Come on, he said, let's go home. And as they walked back toward the lodge, a single distant howl echoed through the mountains. Low, haunting, familiar. Ethan paused, his breath curling in the air. Then, with a small, knowing smile, he kept walking. The end. Thank you for sticking to the end, and we hope you enjoyed this audiobook.